In 1922, the tomb of Pharaoh Tutankhamun was opened for the first time in over 3,000 years. Gold, jewels, and untouched relics dazzled the world, but something darker stirred beneath the sand. Within weeks, Lord Carnarvon, who financed the dig, died mysteriously of blood poisoning. Others followed: sudden illnesses, strange accidents, even a dog that howled and dropped dead the moment its master passed. Newspapers whispered of a curse. Death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the king. Was it superstition, coincidence, or something ancient and vengeful? The tomb gave up its treasures, but took something in return, and the legend of the mummy's curse was born. In the autumn of 1922, under the searing Egyptian sun, a team of weary archaeologists stood on the cusp of discovery. For years, Howard Carter, the dogged English archaeologist, had searched the Valley of the Kings. The desert had yielded broken pottery, faded inscriptions, fragments of forgotten dynasties, but never the prize he sought. Funded by his patron, the wealthy Lord Carnarvon, Carter believed that somewhere beneath the sand lay the untouched tomb of a boy king, Tutankhamun, the enigmatic pharaoh who had ascended the throne at just 9 years old and died before reaching 20. Many had mocked Carter's persistence. The valley had been scoured for centuries, its secrets supposedly exhausted. Yet he pressed on, guided by instinct and scraps of evidence. By November of that year, his workers struck a set of steps cut into the bedrock, leading downward into darkness. It was a moment destined to alter archaeology forever, and to awaken whispers of a curse that would ripple across the world. The legend of Tutankhamun was itself shadowed in mystery. His reign, between 1332 and 1323 BCE, came at a turbulent moment in Egypt's history. The radical reforms of his predecessor, Akhenaten, had plunged the kingdom into chaos by replacing the pantheon of gods with the worship of Aten, the sun disk. Tutankhamun, little more than a child, restored the old religion, his court guided by powerful advisors who ruled in his stead. His life was short, his reign modest. Yet death made him immortal. Unlike the grand monuments of Ramses or the sprawling temples of Hatshepsut, Tutankhamun's legacy lay not in what he built, but in what survived him. A tomb, hidden and intact, sealed away while others were plundered. The Valley of the Kings, carved into cliffs near Luxor, had been the resting place of pharaohs for centuries. Yet grave robbers had long since stripped most tombs of their treasures. For Carter to find one sealed and untouched was unthinkable. As his workers cleared rubble from the staircase, they revealed a doorway stamped with royal seals, the cartouche of Tutankhamun unmistakable in the dust. Carter himself trembled as he realized what lay before him. On November 26, 1922, he peered through a small hole in the doorway, held a candle to the gap, and saw wonderful things. Golden couches shaped like animals, chariots, alabaster vases, and the shimmer of eternity itself. News spread like wildfire. In an age captivated by ancient mysteries, the discovery electrified the world. Newspapers from London to New York filled their pages with breathless reports. Photographers crowded the valley, and dignitaries clamored for a glimpse. Yet alongside came unease. Egyptian locals muttered warnings. Ancient inscriptions, they said, spoke of curses laid upon those who disturbed the resting place of kings. Carter dismissed such talk as superstition, but rumors grew. Even before the burial chamber was fully opened, stories circulated of strange happenings, unexplained illnesses, eerie coincidences, sudden deaths. Central to the legend was Lord Carnarvon, the aristocratic sponsor whose fortune had bankrolled the expedition. Only months after the discovery, in April 1923, Carnarvon fell ill in Cairo. He had suffered an infected mosquito bite, which worsened after a shaving accident. Within days, blood poisoning set in, and he died in agony. At the exact moment of his death, the lights in Cairo reportedly flickered and went out. Back in England, his favorite dog howled and collapsed dead. Newspapers seized on the tale, declaring the curse of Tutankhamun had claimed its first victim. Though scientists argued Carnarvon's death had rational explanations, septicemia was hardly mysterious. The timing was too uncanny for the public to ignore. Headlines screamed of vengeance from beyond the grave. Death comes to those who disturb the pharaoh, they proclaimed. Soon, Every illness, accident, or misfortune that befell anyone connected to the tomb was woven into the legend. Carter's team members who died young, visitors who fell ill after touring the site, even relatives of Carnarvon, all were said to have succumbed to the pharaoh's wrath. What made the story so powerful was not the deaths themselves, but the atmosphere surrounding them. Tutankhamun's tomb was a place where past and present collided, where the living intruded upon the silence of the dead. Its walls bore painted scenes of gods and rituals, its chambers crammed with treasures meant to accompany the boy king into eternity. To breach that sanctity was to trespass against cosmic order, at least in the minds of those who believed in curses. And so, each coincidence became an omen, each tragedy confirmation. In reality, Carter himself lived nearly 2 decades after the discovery, dying peacefully in 1939. Many members of his team also lived long lives. But the myth had already taken root. It was too compelling to resist. For a world recovering from the Great War, enthralled by mysteries and fearful of mortality, the idea of a pharaoh's curse carried irresistible weight. It captured the tension between science and superstition, reason and fear. What, then, was the truth? Was the curse real, or merely the product of coincidence, infection, and sensational journalism? Some modern scientists suggest that spores or toxins, sealed in the tomb for millennia, might have contributed to illnesses among those who entered. Others dismiss the idea as myth entirely. This information has not been verified, as cautious scholars often remind. What is certain is that the story of the curse outlived the individuals it supposedly claimed. It became part of the fabric of Tutankhamun's legacy, as enduring as the golden mask that stared back from his sarcophagus. The boy king, once a minor figure in history, became immortal through death twice over, first by his tomb's discovery, and then by the legend of his vengeance. The curse was not inscribed on stone walls, but written in human imagination, spreading across continents faster than any plague. Even today, when visitors gaze upon Tutankhamun's treasures in museums, they sense something uncanny, as though the pharaoh still watches, still judges, still remembers. Thus, the story begins not only with the opening of a tomb, but with the opening of a myth. A myth born of discovery and death, of coincidence and fear, of human hunger for meaning in the face of the unknown. For the leech, history was about medicine. For Tutankhamun, it is about mortality. His tomb was meant to preserve eternity, yet in being found, it unleashed mortality's reminder upon the living. The curse of Tutankhamun's tomb is therefore not simply the tale of mysterious deaths. It is a mirror of ourselves. Our awe, our ambition, our superstition, and our relentless need to explain the inexplicable. The boy king may have slept for over 3,000 years, but when his slumber was disturbed, he awoke not in vengeance, but in legend. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in November 1922 was not simply an archaeological triumph. It was a cultural detonation. The world, still scarred by the Great War and hungry for mystery, turned its eyes to the Valley of the Kings. Yet no sooner had Howard Carter and his team pierced the seal of the burial chamber than a darker story began to unfold, one that would capture imaginations even more than the treasures themselves. At its center stood George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, patron of the excavation and the first supposed victim of what would come to be known as the Curse of the Pharaohs. Lord Carnarvon had been an unlikely figure to find himself entwined with the destiny of an Egyptian king. Born into aristocratic privilege in 1866, he was a man of refinement but also restlessness. A motoring accident in Germany had left him frail, his lungs damaged, and his health perpetually uncertain. Doctors advised him to spend winters in warmer climates, and thus he gravitated to Egypt. There he found not only relief but purpose, immersing himself in the romance of excavation. His partnership with Howard Carter, forged in 1907, would prove fateful. Where Carter possessed tireless determination and archaeological expertise, Carnarvon supplied wealth, influence, and the conviction that their shared pursuit would yield history's greatest treasure. When the entrance to Tutankhamun's tomb was revealed, Carnarvon was at Carter's side. He was present on November 26, 1922, when Carter first peered through the small hole in the sealed doorway and uttered his famous words, Yes, wonderful things. Together they gazed upon the golden couches, the ivory chariots, and the scattered jewels of a forgotten world. It was a moment of triumph, the culmination of years of effort, setbacks, and financial strain. For Carnarvon, it must have felt like vindication. Proof that his fragile health and dwindling fortune had not been wasted in the pursuit of dreams. But fate, if one believes in such forces, was waiting. In March 1923, only a few months after the discovery, Carnarvon fell ill while staying at the Continental Savoy Hotel in Cairo. Accounts vary, but most agree that a mosquito bite on his cheek became infected after he accidentally cut it while shaving. The infection worsened, spreading to his bloodstream, leading to pneumonia and septicemia. He lingered in agony for weeks. On April 5, 1923, at the age of 56, Lord Carnarvon died. The death might have passed as tragic misfortune had it not been for the eerie circumstances surrounding it. Newspapers reported that at the exact moment Carnarvon died, all the lights in Cairo mysteriously went out. At Highclere Castle, his family estate in England, his beloved dog Susie was said to have let out a mournful howl before collapsing dead. Soon after, journalists claimed that an inscription in Tutankhamun's tomb had forewarned, "Death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the peace of the king." Whether such an inscription ever existed remains doubtful. Archaeologists have never confirmed its presence, but the story was too tantalizing to resist. The press seized upon these details with frenzy. Headlines screamed of Pharaoh's vengeance and the curse of the tomb. The idea of an ancient malediction wreaking havoc on modern intruders was irresistible, blending archaeology with the Gothic, science with superstition. The Times of London, which held exclusive rights to Carter's reports, maintained a more sober tone, but other papers from New York to Paris to Bombay indulged in speculation. For a public weary of post-war reality, the curse provided both thrill and cautionary tale. Proof, perhaps, that some mysteries should remain untouched. Egyptian nationalists, eager to resist Western domination of their antiquities, also fanned the flames. To them, the curse symbolized more than superstition, it was justice. Foreigners had plundered the resting places of their ancestors for centuries. That one such intruder had met a mysterious end was poetic retribution, a narrative that bolstered calls for Egypt to reclaim control of its heritage. The curse thus became political, entwined with the rising tide of Egyptian independence. Carnarvon's death was only the beginning. Over the years that followed, a string of other deaths, some sudden, some ordinary, were attributed to the curse. Prince Ali Camel Fahmy Bey of Egypt was shot by his wife in 1923 after visiting the tomb. Sir Archibald Douglas Reed, who took X-rays of Tutankhamun's mummy, died suddenly in 1924. Arthur Mace, a member of Carter's team, succumbed to illness in 1928. Each death, whether linked or not, was added to the tally of the curse. By some counts, more than 20 individuals connected to the tomb died prematurely. Skeptics pointed out that many others, including Carter himself, lived long lives. Yet in the public mind, the curse had become real, woven from coincidence, grief, and imagination. Carnarvon's fate set the template. An aristocrat struck down by an insect's bite at the height of triumph. His death marked by uncanny coincidences. For believers, it was clear proof that the boy king had defended his eternal rest. For skeptics, it was simply the tragic end of a man with fragile health, living in a land rife with infection. But in truth, the curse was never about fact. It was about story. And in this story, Lord Carnarvon was the first sacrifice. The power of his death lies in its symbolism. Tutankhamun, who died young and forgotten, now reached across millennia to claim another life. The curse dramatized the collision of past and present, of imperial ambition and ancient sanctity. It turned archaeology into myth and discovery into cautionary tale. Without the curse, Tutankhamun's tomb would still have been extraordinary. With it, it became legend. Howard Carter, ever the rationalist, dismissed the curse as nonsense. He continued his work unshaken, cataloging treasures and overseeing the painstaking removal of artifacts. Yet even he could not silence the whispers. Visitors to the tomb, journalists camped in the valley, and Egyptians who lived nearby all spoke of strange feelings, of oppressive atmospheres, of a sense that they were trespassing on sacred ground. In such an environment, every death, every accident, every illness became part of a narrative too compelling to ignore. Lord Carnarvon's death was the spark that lit the flame of the curse. Without it, perhaps the story would never have taken hold. With it, the idea of pharaonic vengeance spread like wildfire, enduring for decades. Even today, nearly a century later, his name remains inseparable from the legend. In dying, he became the first character in a drama that would capture the world's imagination. The drama of a curse that blurred the line between myth and history, fear and fact. In the weeks following Lord Carnarvon's death in April 1923, the Valley of the Kings became more than an archaeological site. It became the stage for a drama that transfixed the world. The sands around Tutankhamun's tomb, once quiet save for the scraping of Carter's workers, now pulsed with whispers of supernatural vengeance. It was not science but story that seized the public imagination, and the press, sensing opportunity, gave those whispers a voice that would echo far beyond Egypt's borders. The modern world was primed for such a tale. The 1920s were an age of both innovation and anxiety. The First World War had left millions dead and entire nations shattered. The Spanish influenza pandemic of 1918 had reminded humanity of mortality's fragility. In this climate, the discovery of an intact royal tomb offered both wonder and dread. Wonder at its treasures, dread at the possibility that the dead still guarded their secrets. Lord Carnarvon's death, sudden and uncanny, provided the spark. Journalists wasted no time fanning it into flame. British newspapers led the charge. The Daily Express and the Daily Mail printed lurid accounts of the so-called Pharaoh's curse. American papers followed suit, their headlines filled with words like vengeance and death warning. One particularly sensational report claimed that Carter had discovered an inscription on the tomb's entrance reading, "Death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the king." Archaeologists later denied the existence of such words, but the denial mattered little. The curse was already alive in print, and print gave it immortality. Journalists camped in Luxor and Cairo churned out stories of strange happenings. They reported that Carnarvon's lights had gone out at the exact moment of his death, that his dog had died simultaneously in England, that cobras had been seen slithering near Carter's house in Luxor. Each anecdote, true or embellished, became proof of the supernatural. Soon, every death connected remotely to the excavation was counted as part of the curse. A French Egyptologist who died of pneumonia, a financial backer who suffered a stroke, even a relative of Carnarvon who passed away, each was woven into the tally. By some newspaper accounts, more than 20 people had succumbed. Howard Carter himself, pragmatic and unsentimental, grew increasingly frustrated. He insisted there was no curse, no supernatural malediction, only coincidence exaggerated by sensational journalism. In his diary, he noted wryly that he, who had spent the most time in the tomb, remained healthy. Yet his protests were drowned by the roar of public imagination. For every skeptical statement, there were 10 more headlines screaming of doom. The curse became more than a curiosity. It became a global phenomenon. In London, spiritualist circles cited it as evidence of the survival of the soul and the dangers of disturbing the dead. Seances were held in which mediums claimed to speak with Tutankhamun's restless spirit. In Cairo, Egyptian nationalists embraced the story as poetic justice. For centuries, Western powers had plundered their heritage, shipping mummies and treasures to foreign museums. Now, they said, the pharaoh himself had risen in vengeance. The curse thus became entwined with politics, a symbol of defiance against colonial intrusion. The public's fascination extended beyond newspapers. Novelists and playwrights quickly adapted the theme, producing stories of archaeologists undone by ancient wrath. Hollywood, too, would later seize upon the motif, with Boris Karloff's The Mummy, 1932, drawing directly on the curse of Tutankhamun for inspiration. The trope of the vengeful mummy, awakened from slumber to punish intruders, entered popular culture as archetype. What had begun as rumor in the Valley of the Kings became one of the defining myths of the modern age. What made the curse so compelling was its resonance with timeless fears. To disturb the dead has always carried weight in human imagination. From Greek myths of Hades to Christian teachings about sacred burial, cultures across the world warn against violating tombs. Tutankhamun's curse tapped into this deep reservoir of dread. The sight of golden treasures glittering in the dark chambers of the boy king only heightened the tension. Beauty and death intertwined, allure and punishment inseparable. The press did more than report, it created. By repeating rumors, exaggerating coincidences, and framing deaths as part of a pattern, newspapers shaped reality itself. In an era before television and instant communication, print held immense power. Readers in New York, Paris, and Tokyo felt as if they, too, stood in the valley, watching as invisible forces struck down the arrogant explorers. The curse became not just a story but an experience, shared across continents. Meanwhile, the excavations continued. Carter and his team worked methodically, cataloging and removing thousands of objects from the tomb. Yet even as they labored with scientific rigor, they did so under the shadow of superstition. Workers muttered prayers before entering. Visitors crossed themselves. Some refused to step inside altogether. The valley, once the domain of archaeology, had become a theater of myth. Carter's refusal to acknowledge the curse publicly did little to slow its spread. His silence was interpreted as confirmation, his denials as defensiveness. Even his long survival became part of the legend. Some suggested he was spared because he had respected the king, while others insisted his death would come eventually, delayed but inevitable. When he finally died in 1939 at the age of 64, newspapers still framed it in the context of the curse, though nearly 17 years had passed since Carnarvon's death. The curse's grip on the imagination reveals more about humanity than about Tutankhamun. It shows our hunger for narrative in the face of coincidence, our instinct to weave tragedy into pattern, our need to believe that the dead can speak through fate. It also demonstrates how modern media can transform isolated events into global mythology. Without newspapers, the curse might have remained a local rumor. With them, it became one of the 20th century's most enduring legends. Thus, in the spring of 1923, the Valley of the Kings became more than an excavation site. It became the setting of a myth reborn. Tourists flocked, journalists embellished, spiritualists speculated, and politicians pointed to divine retribution. The tomb was no longer just a chamber of treasures, but a crucible of story, where archaeology and imagination fused. Tutankhamun, forgotten in life, had become immortal in death, not only through his golden mask, but through the whispered terror of his curse. The curse was not inscribed on the walls of the tomb. It was inscribed in human fear. Its words were written not in hieroglyphs, but in headlines. Yet that made them no less powerful. Once spoken, they could not be silenced. The boy king had slept undisturbed for 3,000 years, but when his slumber was broken, it was not just treasures that emerged from the dark. It was a legend that would haunt the modern world. The death of Lord Carnarvon in April 1923 was only the first act in the unfolding drama. Once the notion of a curse took hold, every subsequent misfortune connected to Tutankhamun's tomb was scrutinized, catalogued, and woven into the narrative. The press, insatiable for sensation, constructed elaborate lists of victims, numbering them with morbid precision. To the public, these tallies became proof of supernatural vengeance, each new death confirming what Carnarvon's fate had already suggested, that disturbing the boy king's rest came at a price. The earliest additions to the list were close associates of the excavation. Prince Ali Kamel Fahmy Bey, an Egyptian aristocrat who had toured the tomb shortly after its discovery, was shot dead by his French wife in a scandalous Parisian hotel dispute in 1923. Newspapers wasted no time linking his death to the curse, despite the obvious human motives behind it. Sir Archibald Douglas Reed, the radiologist who had X-rayed Tutankhamun's mummy in 1925, died unexpectedly soon after. Arthur Mace, a trusted member of Carter's team, succumbed to illness in 1928, his weakened health attributed by many to the supernatural forces of the tomb. The deaths accumulated like beads on a string. Hugh Evelyn White, a young British archaeologist who assisted Carter, reportedly took his own life in 1924. Rumors claimed he left behind a note scrawled in his own blood, declaring he had been cursed. Though later accounts disputed this detail, the image was too evocative for journalists to ignore. Another case was that of Sir Lee Stack, Governor-General of Sudan, assassinated in Cairo in 1924. Though his role in the excavation was tenuous, the press folded his death into the growing ledger of doom. By the late 1920s, lists of supposed victims circulated widely, some claiming that more than 20 people linked to the tomb had died prematurely. Among them were financiers, aristocrats, museum staff, and distant acquaintances. Many of these connections were tenuous, but in the fever of public imagination, proximity was enough. To read such lists in the papers was to feel the chilling hand of inevitability, as though the curse reached across continents and oceans to strike its targets. The most striking part of the tally, however, was the omission: Howard Carter himself. As the man most intimately involved in the tomb's opening, Carter should have been the first to fall. Yet he lived another 16 years after Carnarvon's death, dying peacefully in 1939 at the age of 64. Skeptics pointed to his survival as proof the curse was a fiction. Believers offered explanations: that Carter was spared because he had shown respect for the pharaoh, or that his death was merely delayed, the curse patient in its vengeance. Even Carter's death from lymphoma was reported by some papers as the final stroke of Tutankhamun's wrath, though the decades-long delay stretched credibility. Statistical analysis done in later years revealed that, of the 58 people present when Tutankhamun's tomb and sarcophagus were opened, only 8 died within the first 12 years, no higher a mortality rate than average for the era. Many others lived long, full lives. Lord Carnarvon's death, tragic though it was, could be explained by his fragile health and the prevalence of infection in early 20th century Egypt. Yet logic never had the power that story did. Once the idea of the curse took root, facts mattered little. What made the toll of the curse so compelling was not the number of deaths, but the way they were framed. Each obituary became a chapter in the narrative, each illness a reminder of the pharaoh's supposed wrath. When Sir Bruce Ingram, a friend of Carter's, received a gift of a mummified hand as a paperweight, his house burned down, then flooded. Though coincidence explained both events, the press declared the curse had followed him home. Such anecdotes, sensational and uncanny, gave flesh to the myth in ways that numbers could not. The curse's tally extended beyond individuals to institutions. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, which had sponsored Carter in earlier excavations, returned many of its Egyptian artifacts after a series of staff illnesses and deaths were rumored to be linked to their collection. Museums across Europe reported drops in attendance as whispers spread that even viewing Tutankhamun's treasures might invite misfortune. The curse, once confined to the valley, had become a cultural contagion, infecting the imagination of entire nations. Egyptians themselves were divided. Many local workers scoffed at the idea, attributing deaths to natural causes and dismissing foreign hysteria. Others saw it as vindication of long-held beliefs, that the tombs of the pharaohs were sacred, not to be disturbed by outsiders. For them, the curse symbolized justice, a spiritual rebuke of colonial plunder. It gave voice to the unspoken resentment that Westerners had turned their ancestors' resting places into spectacles for profit and fame. Psychologists of the time offered another explanation, the so-called curse syndrome. They argued that those who believed in the curse might develop psychosomatic symptoms, fear, stress, and paranoia, weakening the immune system and hastening death. Modern science supports this possibility, noting the role of stress in health outcomes. To walk into a tomb convinced of its curse might be to carry death in one's mind as much as in one's body. Still, the tally of victims continued to grow in legend, if not in fact. Books, plays, and eventually films amplified the narrative, embellishing it with dramatic flourishes. Tutankhamun's curse became less about archaeology and more about morality, a warning that greed and arrogance would be punished, that ancient sanctities must be respected. Whether or not the deaths were truly connected, the story had a coherence that coincidence could never achieve. In truth, the so-called toll of the curse was a patchwork of tragedy, coincidence, and invention. Some deaths were real but unrelated, others exaggerated or misreported, still others entirely fabricated by a press hungry for sensation. Yet the power of the list lay in its accumulation. Death by death, story by story, the curse seemed to build momentum, as though Tutankhamun's hand reached invisibly through time. The legacy of the toll remains. Even today, tourists visiting the Valley of the Kings are told stories of Carnarvon and the others who followed. Museums displaying Tutankhamun's treasures often mention the curse, not as fact, but as legend, knowing that the myth is inseparable from the history. The boy king's tomb may have been meant to preserve him for eternity, but in disturbing it, Carter and Carnarvon ensured that his death would be shared by others, real or imagined. Thus, the toll of the curse is not measured in numbers, but in belief. It is the sum not of bodies, but of imaginations. For the public of the 1920s and 1930s, each new death confirmed the pharaoh's vengeance. For us today, it reveals the enduring power of narrative, the way fear can transform coincidence into causation and mortality into myth. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 did more than illuminate the wealth of a forgotten boy king. It also cast a harsh light on the politics of archaeology itself. At the heart of the curse lay not only questions of superstition, but also issues of ownership, identity, and power. For Egyptians, the curse was more than a story of supernatural vengeance. It became a potent metaphor for justice against centuries of foreign exploitation. To understand the legend of Tutankhamun fully, one must place it within the wider struggle between Egypt and the imperial powers that sought to possess its past. By the early 20th century, Egypt was effectively under British control. Though technically a protectorate rather than a colony, its politics and antiquities were heavily influenced by foreign interests. European archaeologists dominated excavations, European museums displayed the finest treasures, and European patrons financed the expeditions. Egyptians often worked as laborers in the Valley of the Kings, digging the very soil of their ancestors, yet were rarely credited or empowered in the field scholarship. The wealth of ancient Egypt flowed out of the country as surely as the Nile flowed through it. When Carter and Lord Carnarvon uncovered Tutankhamun's tomb, therefore, the triumph was celebrated in London and New York as much as in Cairo. Yet Egyptians viewed it differently. Here was the resting place of a pharaoh, a son of their soil, opened by foreigners, his treasures catalogued in English ledgers, his face revealed to foreign cameras. The legend of the curse, whispered by locals even before Carnarvon's death, resonated as a symbol of resistance. If Tutankhamun struck down intruders, it was not superstition but justice, the ancestors avenging themselves against foreign violation. Lord Carnarvon's demise only deepened this sentiment. To many Egyptians, his death was not coincidence, but retribution. The fact that he was British, the very emblem of foreign domination, gave the story moral clarity. Westerners might laugh at curses, but Egyptians saw in it vindication of their belief that the tombs were sacred and should never have been disturbed by outsiders. Each subsequent death attributed to the curse was framed as another blow for justice, another act of reclamation. The political dimension of the curse grew in tandem with the nationalist movement. In 1922, the very year Tutankhamun's tomb was discovered, Britain formally declared Egypt independent, though British troops and officials still wielded immense influence. Egyptian intellectuals and activists used the curse as a rhetorical weapon. Newspaper editorials framed it as a warning. Egypt's past could not be plundered without consequence. Pamphlets and speeches cited the curse as symbolic proof that even in death, the pharaohs resisted foreign domination. The Egyptian press amplified this interpretation. While British and American papers emphasized sensational horror, Egyptian papers often framed the curse as divine justice. They connected the deaths not to myth but to morality. Intruders had stolen from the tombs, and they paid the price. Some writers explicitly linked the curse to Egypt's political struggle, drawing parallels between the desecration of Tutankhamun's tomb and the exploitation of the modern nation. The boy king, they suggested, had become a symbol of independence, his curse a metaphor for Egypt's enduring strength. Carter himself was caught in the middle of this political storm. Though he defended his work as scientific, he could not escape accusations of cultural theft. Negotiations over the division of Tutankhamun's treasures became tense. Traditionally, excavators were allowed to share discoveries with the Egyptian government, but Tutankhamun's tomb was so extraordinary that Egyptian officials refused to allow any artifacts to leave the country. Carter and Carnarvon's heirs fought bitterly, but ultimately Egypt retained full ownership. This outcome was celebrated nationally as a victory, a reversal of centuries of foreign plunder. The curse, whether believed or not, had served its purpose as moral pressure, ensuring that Tutankhamun remained in Egyptian soil. The politics of the curse also influenced the treatment of Egyptian workers. Many of the local men who labored in the valley were absent from Western accounts, their names erased even as their sweat unearthed the treasures. Yet within Egypt, they told their own stories. Some spoke of warnings ignored, of strange presences felt in the tomb, of prayers whispered to ward off misfortune. For them, the curse was not metaphor but lived reality, reinforcing their sense that the tombs should remain untouched. Beyond Egypt, the curse played into wider debates about colonialism. In Europe and America, critics of imperialism pointed to the story as symbolic. The empire that robs graves invites retribution. Satirical cartoons depicted Western archaeologists struck down by ghostly pharaohs, their greed punished by the very history they sought to exploit. The curse thus became a parable about the arrogance of empire, a myth through which modern anxieties about exploitation and decline were expressed. At the same time, Western audiences consumed the curse as exotic entertainment. Newspapers framed it as thrilling proof of Oriental mystery, reinforcing stereotypes of the East as a land of superstition and magic. Hollywood films soon followed, cementing the mummy as a cultural archetype. These portrayals exoticized Egypt, reducing its history to spectacle while ignoring the deeper political realities. For Egyptians, the curse symbolized justice. For Westerners, it was fantasy. In this divergence lay the power of myth. The same story could serve as weapon of resistance and as fodder for entertainment. The politics of the curse were not confined to the 1920s. In the decades that followed, Egypt's struggle for control over its antiquities continued. When Tutankhamun's treasures toured the world in the 1970s, generating massive revenue, Egyptian officials reminded audiences that these artifacts were not Western curiosities, but national heritage. Even today, the curse lingers as subtext in debates about repatriation. The Boy King's vengeance, real or imagined, still reminds the world that Egypt's past belongs to Egypt. In this sense, the curse is inseparable from colonial history. It is not merely a tale of mysterious deaths, but a commentary on power. Who owns the past? Who speaks for the dead? Who benefits from discovery? Lord Carnarvon's death was tragic, but its meaning was transformed by the politics of his time. To the West, it was an eerie coincidence. To Egyptians, it was justice, a pharaoh's warning to those who would steal his eternity. Thus, the curse of Tutankhamun is not just a ghost story, but a political allegory. It reveals how archaeology is never neutral, how the act of excavation is also an act of power. The pharaoh's justice, real or imagined, became a voice for a nation struggling to reclaim itself. The boy king, once forgotten, became symbol not only of ancient splendor, but of modern sovereignty. The curse endures because it speaks to both fear and hope. To the superstitious, it warns of vengeance. To the oppressed, it promises justice. To the colonizer, it whispers of retribution. And to the colonized, it affirms that even in death, their ancestors resist. Tutankhamun's tomb was not only a chamber of gold and stone, but a battlefield of meaning, where the politics of past and present collided. As the legend of the curse spread across the world, fueled by headlines and whispered retellings, there were always those who sought to pierce through the fog of superstition with the sharp edge of reason. For scientists and physicians, the deaths linked to Tutankhamun's tomb were not evidence of supernatural vengeance, but of coincidence, biology, and environment. In the dim chambers of the Valley of the Kings, they argued, the real threats were not curses but microbes, toxins, and the frailty of human health. The most enduring scientific explanation has been that of pathogens sealed within the tomb for millennia. When Howard Carter and his team broke the seals of Tutankhamun's burial chambers, they were not only releasing stale air, but potentially ancient molds and bacteria. Some researchers speculated that fungi such as Aspergillus flavus, known to produce harmful aflatoxins, could have been present on the walls or artifacts. Inhaling spores in a confined space could cause respiratory illness, particularly in those with weakened immune systems. Lord Carnarvon, already fragile from his earlier accident and chronic lung condition, would have been especially vulnerable. His fatal bout of septicemia may not have been divine vengeance, but opportunistic infection. Later analyses have added weight to these theories. In the 1980s and 1990s, microbiologists studying ancient tombs found colonies of potentially harmful fungi thriving on organic materials, wood, cloth, and mummies themselves. Such organisms could survive for centuries in dark, sealed environments, waiting only for new hosts. Even if they did not directly kill, they could exacerbate existing conditions, triggering fevers, pneumonia, or sepsis. To step into a sealed chamber after 3,000 years, scientists suggested, was less a spiritual risk than a biological gamble. Another explanation concerned toxins, the decomposition of organic matter. Plants placed in burial chambers, resins used in embalming, even the body itself, produces chemical byproducts, some of them dangerous. Ammonia, formaldehyde, and hydrogen sulfide can accumulate in enclosed spaces. Exposure, especially in the poorly ventilated corridors of a tomb, could irritate lungs, damage tissue, and contribute to illness. While these effects may not explain every death linked to the curse, they offer plausible mechanisms for the sudden sicknesses that afflicted some visitors. Psychology, too, provided a rational lens. The power of belief is profound, and in the shadowy atmosphere of the Valley of the Kings, belief in a curse could itself prove deadly. Physicians coined the term psychosomatic curse syndrome to describe how fear and suggestion could weaken the body. A person convinced that entering the tomb would bring death might experience stress so severe it compromised their immune system, making them more vulnerable to infection. Others might interpret ordinary ailments, coughs, fevers, even accidents, as supernatural punishment, reinforcing the legend through self-fulfilling prophecy. The mind, in this view, became as potent as any pathogen. Statistical studies later reinforced skepticism. In 2002, a group of epidemiologists examined the survival rates of those who entered Tutankhamun's tomb. They compared the life expectancy of 44 Westerners present during the excavation with that of the general population. Their findings showed no significant difference. In fact, some members of the excavation team lived longer than average. Howard Carter himself lived another 17 years. The curse, from a statistical standpoint, appeared no more lethal than chance. Still, rational explanations did not entirely erase the allure of mystery. The idea of hidden spores and toxic gases held its own fascination, transforming the tomb from site of supernatural wrath to a natural laboratory of ancient biology. Newspapers occasionally seized on these scientific theories, presenting them as modern curses, invisible killers hidden in the dust of antiquity. The shift from supernatural to microbial did not diminish the drama, it merely reframed it. For Carter and his contemporaries, however, such explanations were distant. In the 1920s, the germ theory of disease was established, but the idea of spores sealed for millennia was still speculative. Most physicians attributed Carnarvon's death simply to his frailty and misfortune. Yet the mythic resonance of the curse overwhelmed these rational voices. Science struggled to compete with story, for the latter carried far greater weight in the imagination of the public. Beyond the specifics of Tutankhamun's tomb, the curse became a case study in the clash between superstition and science. Anthropologists examined it as an example of cultural narrative shaping behavior. Psychologists used it to demonstrate the placebo and nocebo effects, the ability of belief to heal or to harm. Microbiologists treated it as evidence of the dangers of sealed environments. Each discipline sought to explain what the press had sensationalized, transforming folklore into a puzzle for rational inquiry. And yet, even within science, uncertainties lingered. Could fungi and bacteria truly survive 3,000 years in a sealed chamber? Could toxins build to lethal concentrations? The answers were not always clear. Some studies suggested survivability, others cast doubt. As with so many aspects of the curse, certainty remained elusive. Scholars often preface their conclusions with disclaimers. This information has not been verified. The very ambiguity of the science, ironically, gave new life to the myth, for where certainty fails, imagination thrives. What the scientific search for explanations reveals most clearly is the human need to reconcile mystery with reason. When faced with coincidence and tragedy, we reach for frameworks that provide coherence. For some, that framework is supernatural, the Pharaoh's curse. For others, it is biological, spores and toxins. In both cases, the goal is the same: to make sense of the unsettling, to transform chaos into narrative. The curse, whether mystical or microbial, reminds us of the fragility of human life when confronted with forces beyond our control. Thus, the rationalist assault on the curse never fully killed it. Instead, it created parallel narratives, one of vengeance, one of biology. For the believer, Carnarvon was struck down by Tutankhamun's wrath. For the skeptic, he was felled by infection, chance, and his own weak lungs. For the psychologist, he was undone by the power of fear. For the historian, his death was amplified by politics and the press. Each explanation reflects the concerns of its age, each interpretation a mirror of its culture. Science gave the world tools to dismantle the myth, but it could not replace the allure of the story. For when people peered into Tutankhamun's golden mask, they did not see fungi or microbes. They saw eternity, power, and vengeance. They saw a king who, even in death, refused to be forgotten. And in that gaze, they found not explanation but awe. If Lord Carnarvon's fate gave birth to the legend of the curse, Howard Carter's life became its greatest contradiction. By every measure of the myth, Carter should have been the first victim. He was the one who had orchestrated the search for Tutankhamun, who had ordered the clearing of rubble, who had stooped with trembling hands to pierce the seal of the tomb, and who had held the candlelight to glimpse wonderful things. He disturbed the boy king's slumber more than any other man. Yet, while others supposedly fell victim to mysterious deaths, Carter lived on for nearly 2 decades after the discovery. To believers in the curse, his survival was inexplicable. To skeptics, it was proof that the curse was a fabrication. Either way, Carter stood at the center of one of the 20th century's most enduring legends. Born in 1874 in Kensington, London, Carter was not the typical gentleman scholar of his age. His background was modest, his schooling limited, and his path into Egyptology unconventional. As a teenager, he demonstrated exceptional talent as an illustrator, producing precise drawings of antiquities. This skill brought him to Egypt in the 1890s, where he assisted archaeologists in recording tombs and inscriptions. His meticulousness and determination soon earned him a reputation, though his abrasive personality and unwillingness to bow to authority also brought controversy. In 1907, he partnered with Lord Carnarvon, a union of Carter's expertise and Carnarvon's wealth that would eventually lead to the most famous archaeological discovery in history. By the time Tutankhamun's tomb was uncovered, Carter had endured years of frustration and near failure. Carnarvon had considered withdrawing funding after repeated disappointments. Only Carter's relentless persistence, his refusal to abandon his conviction that the tomb of the boy king remained hidden in the Valley of the Kings, kept the project alive. When success finally came in 1922, it was a vindication not only of archaeology, but of his personal resilience. Yet the glory of discovery was soon overshadowed by Carnarvon's death and the eruption of the curse legend. For Carter, the rise of the curse narrative was infuriating. He was a man of science and discipline, not of mysticism. He dismissed the notion of supernatural vengeance as nonsense, attributing deaths to natural causes and coincidences exaggerated by journalists. He never wavered in his rationalism, even as the world demanded drama. In his memoirs, Carter described the atmosphere of the tomb with awe but not superstition. The artifacts, he wrote, were history, not hauntings. The painted walls depicted rituals, not warnings. To him, the only true curse was ignorance. And yet, Carter's life after the discovery was not free of shadows. His relationship with Egyptian authorities grew increasingly strained as disputes arose over the ownership of Tutankhamun's treasures. Traditionally, Excavators had been granted a share of finds, but given the unprecedented wealth of the tomb, the Egyptian government refused to allow any items to leave the country. Carter, representing Carnarvon's heirs, fought bitterly but unsuccessfully. This conflict tarnished his reputation, casting him in some circles as a stubborn relic of imperial entitlement. Carter also faced personal isolation. Though he had achieved unparalleled fame, he remained a private, somewhat lonely figure. He never married, and after Carnarvon's death, he lost his closest ally. Colleagues often found him difficult, brusque, and uncompromising. His stubborn refusal to indulge the curse narrative further alienated him from a public hungry for spectacle. While Hollywood made mummies into monsters, Carter kept to his work, cataloging thousands of objects with painstaking detail. The golden mask of Tutankhamun, which would later mesmerize the world, passed through his hands not as relic of vengeance, but as artifact to be preserved and studied. Still, the curse dogged him. Each new death attributed to the tomb was reported alongside his name. Journalists often asked him if he feared the pharaoh's wrath. He would answer curtly, sometimes with irritation, sometimes with weary humor. In private, he confided to friends that the superstition was a distraction from the real wonder of the tomb. Yet he also understood that the myth gave Tutankhamun's discovery a global resonance. Without the curse, the story might have remained confined to archaeology. With it, it became legend. Carter's defiance of the curse extended beyond words. It was embodied in his very survival. When he died in 1939 at the age of 64, the myth twisted once more to accommodate his fate. Some claim that his death from lymphoma was the curse finally claiming its most central target, albeit after a long delay. Others insisted his survival disproved the curse entirely. For believers, the pharaoh's vengeance could be patient, striking when the time was right. For skeptics, Carter's long life was the nail in the coffin of superstition. In truth, Carter's survival demonstrates how myths adapt to fit their own logic. The curse was never about facts, but about meaning. If Carter had died young, it would have been proof of the curse's power. Because he lived long, it became proof of the curse's patience or his unique immunity. The myth was flexible enough to absorb contradiction, reshaping itself around reality rather than collapsing under it. Carter, unwilling participant though he was, became part of the narrative whether he liked it or not. Today, Carter is remembered less for the curse than for his achievement. His meticulous excavation, his detailed records, and his devotion to preservation ensured that Tutankhamun's treasures survived not just the millennia in the tomb, but also the chaos of modern discovery. Without Carter's stubborn discipline, the golden mask and the thousands of artifacts might have been lost, scattered, or damaged. He gave the world a glimpse into a past otherwise buried. If the curse was the shadow, Carter's legacy was the light. Yet it is impossible to separate his life from the legend. To the world, Carter was the man who defied the pharaoh's wrath. He walked where others feared, touched what others dared not, and lived to tell the tale. His very survival became its own form of myth, an inverse curse, a reminder that sometimes determination and reason can withstand even the most powerful superstitions. Howard Carter's story, then, is not only of discovery but of resistance. Resistance to despair during years of fruitless digging, resistance to political pressure in the wake of conflict, resistance to superstition in the face of the curse. His name endures because he opened a door that had remained closed for over 3,000 years. And though he never believed in Tutankhamun's vengeance, he became forever linked to it. Proof that even those who reject myth can be consumed by it. The Boy King's tomb made Carter immortal in history, but it was the curse that made him immortal in legend. He was the man who defied the pharaoh's wrath, the archaeologist who survived the curse, the rationalist in a world entranced by superstition. And in that defiance, Carter gave the world not only wonderful things, but a story that continues to haunt and fascinate nearly a century later. At the heart of the legend of the curse lies not Carnarvon, Carter, or the newspapers that fanned the flames, but Tutankhamun himself, the boy king whose gaze, frozen in gold and stone, has haunted the imagination of millions. To understand why the world was so enthralled by the idea of his vengeance, one must look beyond the events of 1922 and into the ancient Egyptian worldview itself, where the dead were never truly silent, and the tomb was not simply a grave, but a threshold between worlds. Tutankhamun ascended the throne around 1332 BCE, a fragile child amid one of Egypt's most turbulent eras. His predecessor, Akhenaten, had shattered centuries of tradition by abolishing the pantheon of gods and elevating Aten, the sun disk, as sole deity. This revolution destabilized the kingdom, alienated priests, and left temples abandoned. When Tutankhamun, then no older than 9, became pharaoh, he restored the old religion, reinstating Ammonius and the traditional gods. Yet his reign was short. He died before the age of 20, his body showing signs of frailty, illness, and possibly injury. Whether he was victim of genetic disease, accident, or murder remains debated, but his death ended not only a life, but a fragile chapter of dynastic continuity. For Egyptians, death was not an end, but a transformation. The tomb was constructed as a house of eternity, filled with treasures, food, and ritual objects to sustain the deceased in the afterlife. The body, carefully mummified, served as vessel for the Ka, spirit, to return to when needed. To disturb a tomb was not merely robbery. It was a violation of cosmic balance, a disruption of the journey between life and afterlife. In this worldview, the concept of a curse was not superstition but spiritual reality. The dead, especially kings, could defend themselves against intrusion. Tutankhamun's tomb, though modest compared to the vast complexes of Ramses or Seti, embodied this belief. The burial chamber's walls bore scenes of Osiris, Anubis, and Hathor, gods of death and rebirth. Ritual spells from the Book of the Dead adorned objects, ensuring protection against evil. Amulets and scarabs were inscribed with warnings meant to deter those who would desecrate the tomb. One of the most famous artifacts, a golden cobra adorning the pharaoh's headdress, symbolized divine protection, ready to strike any who approached with malice. Though Carter denied finding an explicit curse inscription, the tomb itself was saturated with spiritual defenses. The mummy, too, carried its own aura of dread. For centuries, Egyptians had viewed mummies not as relics, but as sacred vessels. To gaze upon the wrapped body of a king was to confront both mortality and divinity. In later times, when Western explorers looted tombs and unwrapped mummies in public spectacles, Egyptians often recoiled at the desecration. The idea that such acts might provoke retribution resonated deeply. Thus, when Carnarvon died, it seemed natural to many Egyptians that the mummy itself had struck back. Modern science has only deepened the mummy's mystique. CT scans of Tutankhamun's body revealed a frail young man, afflicted with malaria, congenital deformities, and possibly the result of inbreeding within the royal family. His left foot was clubbed, his bones showed signs of necrosis. He may have walked with a cane, of which dozens were found in his tomb. The boy king, once thought majestic, appeared fragile, even tragic. Yet it is precisely this fragility that heightens his aura. A young ruler, cut down before his time, hidden away for millennia. His gaze from the golden mask now seems both mournful and accusatory, as though demanding remembrance and respect. The golden mask itself, perhaps the most iconic object of ancient Egypt, embodies this duality of beauty and dread. Crafted with lapis lazuli, obsidian, and quartz, it depicts Tutankhamun's serene visage, eyes inlaid with stone that seem to follow the viewer. To those who entered the tomb, the mask was not mere art but a face of eternity. To meet its gaze was to meet the king himself, transcending death. No wonder that visitors felt unease, even fear, as though the boy pharaoh watched them, judging their intrusion. The curse, in this sense, was not written in words but in eyes of stone. The fascination with the mummy's gaze extends beyond Tutankhamun. Across cultures, the dead have long been seen as guardians of their rest. Greek myths told of shades in Hades punishing those who defied burial rites. Medieval Europe warned of revenants rising from graves. In Victorian times, mummies became subjects of Gothic horror, imagined as reanimated corpses seeking revenge. Tutankhamun's mummy entered this long tradition, its aura amplified by the grandeur of his tomb and the timing of Carnarvon's death. Science has tried to demystify this gaze, analyzing the mask's craftsmanship and the mummy's condition. Yet even CT scans and DNA tests cannot fully erase the sense of presence. Visitors to exhibitions of Tutankhamun's treasures often describe feeling watched, moved, or unsettled. Museums sometimes dim the lights around the mask to emphasize its glow, heightening the aura of awe. Rationally, we know we are looking at gold and stone, at the remains of a long-dead boy. Emotionally, we feel the weight of his eyes. The curse lingers in that gaze, unspoken but undeniable. The mummy's power also lies in its silence. Unlike written curses, which can be debated or dismissed, the body itself cannot be explained away so easily. It is evidence of mortality and of preservation, of life transformed into permanence. To stand before Tutankhamun's mummy is to confront the paradox of eternity captured in fragile form. His body, ravaged by time, still exists. His gaze, preserved in gold, still pierces. This paradox fuels the myth. If the dead endure, perhaps they also act. Some scholars argue that the curse is not a product of Egyptian belief, but of Western projection. Ancient Egyptians prepared their dead with rituals of protection, but they did not conceive of curses in the Gothic sense. That concept, they suggest, arose when Westerners, steeped in Christian notions of sin and Gothic horror, interpreted Egyptian symbols through their own imaginations. The curse, then, is less about Tutankhamun and more about us, our fears of death, our guilt over desecration, our longing for mystery. Still, whether Egyptian or Western in origin, the mummy's presence is undeniable. Tutankhamun himself, once a minor pharaoh, has become immortal through this legend. His tomb, untouched for millennia, preserved not only treasures but an atmosphere of awe. His mummy, fragile yet enduring, became the center of a myth that outlived those who discovered him. His gaze, serene and eternal, became the unspoken curse, the silent judgment of the boy king whose rest had been broken. Thus, the curse of Tutankhamun cannot be separated from Tutankhamun himself. It is not merely about the deaths of Carnarvon or the fears of Carter. It is about the ancient fear of disturbing the dead, embodied in the preserved body of a child pharaoh. His gaze reminds us that death is not silence, that the past is never passive, that memory carries its own power. Whether curse or coincidence, myth or microbiology, Tutankhamun's mummy remains a presence that demands reverence. And perhaps that is the true curse, that even in our age of science, we cannot look into his eyes without feeling watched. By the mid-1920s, the curse of Tutankhamun had leapt from the pages of newspapers into the bloodstream of popular culture. What began as scattered reports of Lord Carnarvon's mysterious death soon became a global obsession, woven into novels, poems, stage plays, and eventually the shimmering screen of Hollywood. The legend of the Boy King's vengeance was no longer confined to the Valley of the Kings. It was transported into the parlors of London, the cafes of Paris, the theaters of New York, and the imagination of the entire modern world. Literature was the first to seize the tale. Sensationalist writers churned out short stories in which archaeologists fell victim to mummy's wrath, their greed punished by spectral guardians of ancient tombs. Spiritualist magazines, already popular in the wake of the First World War, published alleged testimonies of seances in which mediums claimed to channel Tutankhamun's spirit. These accounts reinforced the belief that the dead could reach across millennia to exact revenge. In Gothic and pulp fiction alike, the mummy was transformed from preserved relic into avenger, an undead enforcer of ancient law. Theatrical productions soon followed. In London's West End, plays dramatized the curse with actors wrapped in linen bandages stalking across dimly lit stages. Egypt, long a symbol of exotic mystery in Western art, now carried an added layer of menace. The Boy King, barely remembered in ancient annals, had become a character in global mythology, his curse a shorthand for the dangers of disturbing the past. Audiences, already attuned to the macabre through the popularity of ghost stories, found themselves thrilled by the idea that modern arrogance could be undone by ancient power. It was, however, cinema that immortalized the curse in cultural memory. In 1932, barely a decade after Carnarvon's death, Universal Pictures released The Mummy, starring Boris Karloff. The film told of Imhotep, an ancient priest resurrected from his tomb, who brings death and terror to those who violated his rest. Though the character was not Tutankhamun, the inspiration was obvious. The imagery of archaeologists prying open a sarcophagus, the horror of a mummy's gaze, the inexorable vengeance of the past, all drew from the legend of the Boy King's tomb. The film was a success, and The Mummy joined Frankenstein and Dracula as staples of horror cinema. The curse, transmuted into popular entertainment, had become archetype. Over the decades, the theme repeated endlessly. Mummies stalked across screens in horror films of the 1940s and 1950s, fought adventurers in pulp serials, and re-emerged in comedic parodies. In the late 20th century, blockbusters like The Mummy, 1999, and its sequels reignited the fascination, blending adventure with horror, archaeology with fantasy. Though far removed from historical reality, these films carried forward the essential motif. To disturb the tomb was to invite wrath. Tutankhamun, though seldom named directly, was the ghost behind every bandaged monster, his curse the shadow animating the genre. The influence of the curse extended beyond fiction into everyday culture. Cartoons depicted greedy businessmen as bloated leeches or mummies cursed for their avarice. Political cartoons of the 1920s and 1930s mocked imperial powers as plunderers, doomed by ancient vengeance. Even children's stories and Halloween costumes borrowed the imagery of the mummy, turning horror into play. The Boy King's supposed wrath had become a cultural shorthand, recognizable across languages and generations. Museums, too, capitalized on the fascination. Exhibitions of Egyptian antiquities emphasized not only the beauty of the artifacts, but also the aura of mystery surrounding them. Visitors lined up to see sarcophagi and golden treasures, whispering of curses even as curators dismissed such tales as superstition. When Tutankhamun's treasures toured the world in the 1970s, millions flocked to see the golden mask, many of them drawn as much by the legend as by the artistry. The curse had become part of the marketing, a silent partner in the exhibition's success. The allure of the curse was amplified by timing. In the interwar years, the world was grappling with loss and disillusionment. The Great War had shattered faith in progress. The influenza pandemic had reminded humanity of its fragility. Spiritualism flourished as people sought to connect with the dead. Against this backdrop, the idea of a pharaoh striking down intruders resonated deeply. It confirmed suspicions that science and modernity had not tamed the mysteries of existence, that death still held power. The curse was both warning and comfort. Warning that arrogance invited ruin. Comfort that justice, however delayed, was still possible. Popular culture magnified the legend far beyond what facts supported. In truth, most of those who entered the tomb lived long lives. Carter survived nearly 2 decades. Many deaths attributed to the curse were coincidences, exaggerated or invented by the press. Yet facts mattered little compared to narrative. The curse thrived not because it was true, but because it was useful. It entertained, it warned, it symbolized. It gave voice to fears of mortality, anxieties about colonial plunder, and the timeless thrill of the supernatural. The image of the mummy itself changed as the curse spread. In ancient Egypt, the mummy was sacred, a vessel for the soul. In Victorian times, mummies had been curiosities, unwrapped at social gatherings to amuse the elite. But in the 20th century, under the shadow of Tutankhamun's tomb, the mummy became monster. Bandaged, lumbering, relentless, it symbolized vengeance from beyond the grave. That transformation is one of the most enduring legacies of the curse. Not only shaping entertainment, but also altering how the world perceived ancient Egypt. And yet, alongside horror, there was also fascination and respect. Tutankhamun's treasures, displayed in glass cases, were admired not only for their aura of mystery, but for their artistry. The golden mask, in particular, evoked awe as much as fear. Its serene gaze seemed both protective and accusatory, embodying the duality of the curse, beauty entwined with dread, eternity with vengeance. The Boy King, once a minor figure of history, became immortal not through his deeds, but through the legends woven around his death. The curse of Tutankhamun thus demonstrates the power of culture to reshape reality. It was not the deaths themselves that made the legend, but the stories told about them. Writers, playwrights, filmmakers, and cartoonists all added layers to the myth until it became archetype. Today, few people can hear the word mummy without thinking of curses, bandages, and tombs. The Boy King's tomb created not just a legend, but an entire genre. The enchantment of the curse lies in its ability to cross boundaries. It is history and horror, science and superstition, politics and entertainment. It speaks to scholars and school children, filmmakers and philosophers. It is as much a creation of modern imagination as of ancient burial practices. And in this lies its immortality. The treasures of Tutankhamun may rest in glass cases, but his curse lives on in stories, films, and the collective memory of the modern world. For every believer in Tutankhamun's curse, there has always been a skeptic waiting with ledger and logic to dismantle the legend. The story of the Boy King's vengeance was dramatic, irresistible, and enduring, but when examined closely, its foundation rests more on coincidence, sensational journalism, and human imagination than on supernatural power. The skeptic's case is not merely about debunking ghosts. It is about understanding how myths are made, how fear can be manipulated, and how the modern media shaped one of the 20th century's most famous legends. The first argument raised by skeptics was statistical. If the curse truly struck down those who entered the tomb, Howard Carter should have been the first to perish. Yet Carter lived until 1939, 17 years after the discovery, dying at 64 from lymphoma. Many others on his team also survived long lives. Lady Evelyn Herbert, Carnarvon's daughter, who was among the first to enter the burial chamber, lived until 1980. Dr. Douglas Derry, who unwrapped Tutankhamun's mummy, died peacefully at an advanced age. Out of the 58 people present at the opening of the tomb, only a handful died within a decade, no higher a rate than average mortality for that era. If this was a curse, it was strangely selective and remarkably patient. Skeptics also pointed to Carnarvon's own poor health as a natural explanation for his death. Years before, a motoring accident had damaged his lungs, leaving him vulnerable. When he traveled to Egypt in 1923, he carried a weakened constitution into a land rife with disease and infection. The infected mosquito bite that killed him was tragic, but hardly supernatural. In an age before antibiotics, septicemia was a common and often fatal outcome. To suggest divine vengeance where biology sufficed was, skeptics argued, an act of credulity. Coincidence, they noted, played a powerful role. Death is not rare, and among dozens of people connected to the excavation, some would inevitably fall ill or suffer accidents. Linking these deaths to the tomb was an act of selective memory, counting the misfortunes while ignoring the many who thrived. A radiologist who died of pneumonia, a financier who suffered a stroke, an aristocrat murdered in Paris, all were folded into the legend, even though their deaths bore no rational connection to the tomb. Skeptics describe this as confirmation bias, the human tendency to notice and emphasize events that support a story while overlooking those that do not. The press, hungry for sensation, magnified this bias into global legend. Newspapers of the 1920s competed fiercely for circulation, and the curse was a story too tantalizing to resist. The Daily Mail and the Daily Express in Britain ran headlines dripping with menace. American papers echoed them, embellishing details with abandon. Some journalists even invented inscriptions, such as "Death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the king," which Carter himself denied existed. The more lurid the headline, the greater the sales. In this way, the curse was less discovered than constructed, its words etched not in stone but in ink. Skeptics also pointed to the cultural climate of the 1920s as fertile soil for superstition. The Great War and the influenza pandemic had left millions grieving, searching for meaning in death. Spiritualism flourished, and seances promised communion with the departed. In this atmosphere, the idea of an ancient king reaching across millennia to punish intruders resonated deeply. It provided a narrative that turned grief into justice, chaos into order. The curse, skeptics argued, thrived not because it was real, but because it met a psychological need. Scientific explanations offered further ammunition. Microbiologists later discovered fungi and bacteria in tombs that could, in theory, sicken explorers. Psychologists demonstrated the nocebo effect, the harmful impact of negative belief. A man convinced he was cursed might indeed weaken, fall ill, or even die, not from supernatural power but from the crushing weight of fear. In this view, the curse was not external vengeance, but internal psychology, the mind turning terror into reality. Perhaps the most damning evidence against the curse, skeptics argued, was its inconsistency. If Tutankhamun's wrath truly struck down intruders, why spare the Egyptian workers who labored daily in the tomb? Why allow tourists, dignitaries, and journalists to walk its chambers unharmed? Why claim Carnarvon's death as proof, but ignore Carter's survival? The legend, skeptics concluded, was a patchwork of selective storytelling. It endured because it was thrilling, not because it was true. And yet, skeptics also acknowledged the power of the curse as cultural phenomenon. Even if false, it revealed profound truths about human imagination. The need for narrative, the allure of mystery, the attraction of fear, all converged in the Valley of the Kings. Rational explanations could account for each death, but they could not erase the legend's hold. In fact, the very act of debunking often strengthened it. Every denial by Carter, every statistical study, seemed to deepen the public's fascination. Some skeptics even admitted that the curse had a kind of symbolic truth. It was not real in the supernatural sense, but it was real in its consequences. It shaped perceptions of Egypt, influenced politics of antiquities, inspired literature and film, and haunted the imaginations of millions. A myth that powerful, they argued, did not need to be factually true to be culturally true. It was a story that mattered, and in that sense, it was real. The skeptic's case, therefore, is not merely about dismantling belief, but about reframing it. The curse is better understood not as literal vengeance, but as myth born from coincidence, amplified by media, and sustained by culture. It tells us less about Tutankhamun than about ourselves. Our fears of mortality, our fascination with the exotic, our hunger for stories that make sense of death. Yet here lies the paradox. The skeptics are almost always correct in their explanations, but it is the believers who hold the legend. Facts kill fear, but they rarely kill story. The curse persists not because it withstands scrutiny, but because it transcends it. It lives in novels, films, and whispers, not in statistical charts. Skeptics can tally the survivors. Believers need only one mysterious death to prove their case. And in the end, it is the believer's story that endures in memory. Thus, the skeptic's case is vital, not because it ends the legend, but because it reveals how legends are made. The curse of Tutankhamun is not an ancient inscription, but a modern myth, born of death, grief, imagination, and ink. Its truth lies not in the pharaoh's wrath, but in the human heart's need to believe. The story of Tutankhamun's curse has often been told as a modern invention, an artifact of sensational journalism and Gothic imagination. Yet it would be a mistake to believe that the idea of curses was entirely foreign to ancient Egypt. Though no inscription reading, "Death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the king," has ever been found, Egyptians did surround their dead with warnings, protections, and rituals designed to deter desecration. To understand the legend of Tutankhamun's curse, one must step back into the worldview of the people who built his tomb, where death was not silence but transformation, and where the line between the living and the dead was porous. For ancient Egyptians, the tomb was not merely a grave but a house of eternity, a carefully constructed environment in which the deceased could continue existence. Within it lay the body, mummified to preserve the vessel for the soul, treasures and provisions to sustain the journey, and inscriptions that served as both prayer and protection. These inscriptions often included threats, warnings against intruders who might steal or desecrate. Some curses were poetic, others blunt. One tomb inscription discovered at Saqqara warns, "As for all men who shall enter this tomb in their impurity, there will be judgment. I shall seize his neck like a bird." Another, from the Middle Kingdom, declares, "He who disturbs the tomb of a noble shall have no heir. His house shall be destroyed, and his soul shall never rest." Such statements were not idle. They reflected the deep Egyptian conviction that the afterlife was precarious, constantly in need of protection. The soul's journey could be interrupted by malicious spirits, by negligence, or by intrusion. To safeguard it, Egyptians invoked the gods, employed magical spells, and inscribed curses upon the walls of tombs. These were not Gothic maledictions in the modern sense, but religious guarantees, ritual extensions of justice. To break a tomb was to disrupt cosmic order, and the violator might expect divine retribution. Tutankhamun's tomb itself contains no explicit curse inscription, but it does include protective symbols. The cobra and vulture on his golden mask represent the deities Wadjet and Nekbet, guardians of Upper and Lower Egypt, whose role was to defend the king in both life and death. Amulets placed within the wrappings of his mummy bore spells from the Book of the Dead, calling upon gods to strike down enemies. Figures of Anubis, god of embalming and protector of tombs, stood sentinel among the treasures. These artifacts served as warnings in their own right, silent reminders that the king was not alone in death. The belief in curses was reinforced by broader Egyptian notions of Ma'at, the cosmic order of truth, justice, and balance. To violate a tomb was not simply theft, it was an assault on Ma'at. Such acts required correction, either through legal punishment in the world of the living or divine vengeance in the realm of the dead. Thus, tomb curses were expressions of moral as well as spiritual order, ensuring that the sanctity of burial was preserved. In this light, the modern legend of Tutankhamun's curse can be seen as echo rather than invention. While journalists embroidered the story with Gothic flair, the roots lay in authentic Egyptian traditions. The idea that a king might strike back from the grave was not absurd to Egyptians. It was natural, expected, and feared. When Carnarvon died, the ancient belief in tomb curses provided cultural scaffolding upon which modern superstition was built. Egyptians, steeped in this tradition, found the story credible. Western audiences, primed by Gothic fiction, found it thrilling. It is also significant that the Valley of the Kings had long been a site of tomb robbery. In antiquity itself, thieves sought gold and jewels, often at the expense of mummies and inscriptions. In response, priests sometimes reburied kings in hidden caches, fearing further desecration. The survival of Tutankhamun's tomb, largely untouched for millennia, was the exception rather than the rule. To disturb such a rare sanctuary seemed doubly dangerous, as though its preservation had been ensured by divine will. When Carter and Carnarvon pried open the sealed doors, they were not merely archaeologists. They were, in Egyptian eyes, tomb robbers on a grand scale. The idea of a curse was the natural consequence of such intrusion. Interestingly, some scholars suggest that the curse's survival owes as much to Egyptian nationalism as to Western superstition. By invoking ancient curses, Egyptians could claim continuity with their ancestors, asserting that their dead kings still protected them. In the 1920s, as Egypt struggled for independence from British influence, the story of Tutankhamun's wrath resonated as symbol of cultural resilience. It was as if the boy king himself had joined the struggle, punishing the foreigner who dared trespass. Modern archaeology confirms that Egyptians took tomb protection seriously. Excavations have revealed warning inscriptions, magical bricks placed in burial chambers, and elaborate rituals designed to safeguard the dead. Though these may not correspond to Hollywood-style curses, they demonstrate a consistent belief in the active power of the deceased. Tutankhamun's tomb, filled with protective artifacts and symbols, was part of this continuum. The absence of a dramatic inscription does not negate the presence of a curse. It merely shifts it from words to ritual. What, then, distinguishes ancient Egyptian curses from the modern legend? Primarily, their focus. For Egyptians, tomb curses were not directed at abstract intruders, but at specific desecrators. They promised loss of children, destruction of lineage, denial of afterlife, punishments aligned with Egyptian values. The modern curse, by contrast, is broader and more theatrical: sudden death, mysterious accidents, supernatural vengeance. In this sense, the modern myth is a hybrid, fusing Egyptian belief in spiritual protection with Western fascination with Gothic terror. This hybridization is what gives Tutankhamun's curse its unique power. It speaks simultaneously to Egyptian reverence for the dead and to Western fear of the uncanny. It is at once authentic and invented, ancient and modern, local and global. The Boy King's tomb became a meeting point of cultural imaginations, where hieroglyphs and headlines merged into one legend. Ultimately, the ancient echoes remind us that the curse is not a fabrication imposed on an indifferent past, but a dialogue between past and present. Egyptians inscribed curses because they believed in the agency of the dead. Journalists amplified those beliefs because they resonated with modern anxieties. The legend of Tutankhamun, therefore, is not an aberration but a continuation, proof that the voices of the ancients still reverberate in our imaginations. And perhaps that is the true lesson. Whether written in hieroglyphs or printed in newspapers, curses remind us that the dead are never wholly silent. They are remembered, invoked, and feared. Tutankhamun, a frail boy who ruled briefly and died young, has outlasted conquerors and empires. His curse, real or imagined, has ensured that his name is spoken across millennia. In the end, that may have been the most powerful protection of all. When Howard Carter first gazed into Tutankhamun's antechamber and whispered of wonderful things, he could not have foreseen that the Boy King's treasures would become some of the most famous and most traveled artifacts in the world. Yet as these objects left the Valley of the Kings for study, preservation, and eventually exhibition, they carried with them more than beauty and history. They carried the shadow of the curse. Wherever Tutankhamun's treasures went, whispers of misfortune followed, as though the pharaoh's wrath had seeped into gold, alabaster, and stone, ready to punish those who dared to gaze upon them. The first stage of the journey was Cairo, where the Egyptian Museum became custodian of the artifacts. For years after the excavation, Carter and his team painstakingly cataloged thousands of objects: golden shrines, jewelry, chariots, statues, and the now iconic golden mask. Each artifact was a marvel, but also a burden. Handling them required delicate care, and even minor accidents fueled stories of the curse. When museum staff fell ill or suffered misfortune, rumors spread that Tutankhamun's treasures themselves bore malignant power. Workers whispered about hearing footsteps in locked rooms, or feeling sudden chills when handling the king's possessions. Rational explanations abounded, but in the charged atmosphere of the 1920s, every misstep became omen. The shadow lengthened as Tutankhamun's treasures began to travel. In the mid-20th century, the Egyptian government authorized select exhibitions abroad, eager to showcase its heritage but also to assert national pride. When artifacts left Cairo, newspapers revived talk of the curse. Would Tutankhamun allow his treasures to be seen by foreigners again? Each death or accident connected, however distantly, to the exhibitions was folded into the legend. The most famous episode occurred in the 1970s, during the global tour of Tutankhamun's treasures. The Golden Mask, along with over 50 other objects, traveled to the United States, the United Kingdom, and beyond, drawing millions of visitors. Crowds queued for hours to glimpse the Boy King's serene visage. The exhibitions were triumphs of cultural diplomacy, but they were also saturated with whispers of the curse. In 1972, when the treasures were displayed at the British Museum, eerie stories circulated. The museum's director, Dr. Christian de Roche-Noblecourt, reportedly warned staff of the dangers of working late near the artifacts. Guards claimed to hear strange noises in empty galleries, or to feel inexplicable dread when stationed near the Golden Mask. One rumor held that a curator who handled the treasures died suddenly, fueling headlines about the curse's resurgence. Whether these events occurred exactly as reported remains uncertain. This information has not been verified, but the public believed them. When the treasures traveled to the United States in 1976, the curse followed across the Atlantic. In Washington, D.C., where President Jimmy Carter greeted the exhibition, tabloids ran stories suggesting that American officials risked the pharaoh's wrath. A traffic accident involving a museum employee, an unexplained blackout during a press preview, even a minor fall by a visitor, all became evidence. In New Orleans, when a hurricane threatened the city during the exhibition, local papers quipped that Tutankhamun himself had summoned the storm. The objects were beautiful, but also ominous. To gaze upon them was to brush against eternity, and eternity was not always benevolent. Curators and archaeologists tried to dispel the rumors, insisting the curse was pure invention. Yet they were not above exploiting its allure. Posters and advertisements for the exhibitions leaned into the aura of mystery, with taglines that hinted at danger and imagery that emphasized the golden mask's unblinking stare. The curse, though denied, became part of the marketing, a shadowy companion that drew millions into the galleries. Visitors did not come only to admire history. They came to feel the thrill of forbidden knowledge, the shiver of standing in the presence of a king who might still wield power. The artifacts themselves seemed to invite such responses. The golden mask, serene yet piercing, embodied both beauty and menace. Jewelry inlaid with protective amulets reminded viewers that these objects were not made for museums, but for magic, meant to shield the king in the afterlife. Miniature statues of Anubis, god of the dead, crouched as guardians, their black eyes fixed upon intruders. To modern viewers, these were artworks. To ancient Egyptians, they were active agents of protection. The aura of the curse emerged from this tension between art and ritual, history and eternity. In Egypt, the curse retained political resonance. Nationalists pointed to accidents surrounding foreign exhibitions as proof that Tutankhamun should remain at home, his treasures not paraded abroad for profit. When loans were negotiated, debates flared. Was it wise to tempt fate by sending the boy king's possessions into alien lands? Each scratch on an artifact, each delay in shipping, became fuel for arguments that the pharaoh himself opposed the journeys. The curse was thus not only a cultural story but also a tool of sovereignty, reinforcing the idea that Egypt alone should guard its heritage. Beyond official exhibitions, smaller incidents kept the curse alive. Collectors who acquired Egyptian relics, legally or otherwise, sometimes reported streaks of bad luck. A dealer who displayed a funerary figurine in his shop claimed he lost his fortune soon after. Tourists who pocketed shards from tombs reported accidents upon returning home. Museums receiving donations of Egyptian artifacts sometimes found themselves the subject of local gossip when curators fell ill. In each case, the logic was the same. To take what belonged to the dead was to invite punishment. What these stories reveal is the enduring power of objects to carry meaning beyond themselves. A golden mask is not just gold, it is a face of eternity. A scarab is not just a carving, it is a spell. The curse of Tutankhamun traveled with his treasures because people could not separate beauty from danger, art from power. The artifacts embodied both allure and warning, reminding viewers that they were never meant for human eyes, but for the gaze of gods. Even today, when Tutankhamun's treasures tour the world, the shadow lingers. Curators reassure the public that the curse is myth, yet they rarely fail to mention it in press releases. Visitors still whisper in hushed tones as they pass the golden mask, glancing nervously at their own reflections in its polished gold. The boy king remains both fragile and formidable, his possessions shimmering with mystery. Thus, the treasures of Tutankhamun carry not only history but story. They are masterpieces of craftsmanship, but also vessels of fear. They remind us that the past is not inert but alive, that objects can be haunted not by spirits but by imagination. Wherever they travel, the curse follows, stitched into every rumor, every uneasy glance, every whispered tale. The boy king's shadow stretches across oceans, his silence speaking more loudly than words. The curse of Tutankhamun is the most famous, but it is far from the only tale of tombs bringing death to the living. Across the deserts of Egypt and the sands of time, whispers of vengeance have long surrounded the graves of pharaohs, nobles, and commoners alike. For millennia, stories circulated that those who disturbed the dead risked retribution, whether from angry spirits, divine wrath, or the natural hazards of tombs themselves. Tutankhamun's legend may have crystallized in the 1920s, but it grew from a much older soil enriched by countless other tales of death in the desert. Archaeological records reveal that tomb curses were not mere invention. Inscriptions inscribed on walls, coffins, and stelae often carried explicit threats. A 19th dynasty tomb at Saqqara bore the chilling warning, "As for he who shall do evil against this tomb and destroy it, May the crocodile be against him in the water, and may snakes be against him on land. May he who does this not exist. Another inscription from the Middle Kingdom declared that violators would be seized by the council of the gods, their bodies burned, their souls cast adrift. These were not metaphors, but spiritual safeguards, deeply believed in by those who built the tombs. The reality of tomb robbing only deepened the belief in curses. Since ancient times, thieves tunneled into burial chambers to strip them of gold, jewels, and sacred items. Many were caught and punished brutally, but others vanished into legend, their fates unknown. In Egyptian imagination, those who disappeared were presumed punished by divine vengeance. Stories spread of robbers who dropped dead upon entering a chamber, or who suffered years of misfortune until their families perished. In this way, curses were not only threats, but explanations for the mysterious disappearances of tomb breakers. By the 19th century, when European explorers descended on Egypt, these ancient echoes were already entwined with Western fascination. Victorian travelers told stories of uncanny accidents surrounding mummy unwrappings, which had become fashionable spectacles. One tale spoke of a group of gentlemen in London who purchased a mummy case said to bear a priestess's curse. After bringing it into their home, one fell gravely ill, another lost his fortune, and the case eventually found its way to the British Museum, where further tragedies were rumored. This so-called unlucky mummy became infamous, and some even linked it to the sinking of the Titanic in 1912, claiming the artifact had been aboard, though in truth it never left the museum. The story illustrates how curses migrated from Egyptian sands into European parlors, adapting to new contexts while retaining their aura of menace. Other archaeological legends proliferated. In the late 19th century, the French archaeologist Gaston Maspero recorded numerous accounts of strange deaths among tomb raiders. He noted that local Egyptians often refused to enter certain sites, muttering of jinn, spirits who guarded the dead. Even among seasoned scholars, accidents fed superstition. One archaeologist reportedly slipped and fell to his death after mocking an inscription warning intruders away. Another collapsed suddenly in a chamber filled with foul air, his colleagues whispering that the curse had struck. The dangers of tomb exploration offered rational explanations for many of these deaths. The Valley of the Kings was rife with hazards: unstable ceilings, hidden shafts, venomous scorpions, and suffocating air in sealed chambers. Inhaling dust and spores could cause illness. Bats, snakes, and insects lurked in the shadows. To those already primed by cultural belief in curses, these dangers appeared less like chance and more like fate. The legends spread far beyond Egypt. In Mesopotamia, excavators of royal tombs told of strange illnesses afflicting their teams. In China, stories surrounded the mausoleum of the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, whose vast underground complex was said to be protected by rivers of mercury and lethal traps. Wherever the dead were buried with splendor, legends of curses followed, a universal expression of humanity's fear of trespassing against eternity. But in Egypt, the tales carried particular resonance because of the nation's long history of mummification and tomb building. The mummy itself, preserved with uncanny lifelike features, seemed poised between life and death. To disturb such a body was to invite its spirit's wrath. Western audiences, encountering these corpses for the first time in the 19th century, found them both fascinating and terrifying. Writers like Arthur Conan Doyle, author of Sherlock Holmes, eagerly embraced the idea of mummy curses, blending Egyptian lore with Gothic horror to entertain and unsettle. By the time Tutankhamun's tomb was opened in 1922, the idea of tomb curses was already embedded in popular imagination. Lord Carnarvon's death did not create the myth, it confirmed it. Newspapers did not invent the curse from thin air. They drew upon a century of tales about unlucky mummies, cursed artifacts, and vengeful spirits. Tutankhamun's case became the most famous because it was dramatic, timely, and richly symbolic, but it stood atop a mountain of precedent. Even after Carter's discovery, other archaeological sites contributed to the lore. In the 1960s, when Nubian temples were relocated during the construction of the Aswan High Dam, workers whispered of accidents caused by ancient curses. In the 1990s, when archaeologists probed the Great Pyramid of Khufu with cameras and robots, rumors swirled that opening sealed chambers would unleash doom. Each new discovery invited not only scholarship but superstition, a reminder that the shadow of the curse endures. What unites these legends is their function. Curses serve as guardians, deterring violation. They also serve as explanations, making sense of misfortune. And they serve as symbols, reminding the living that the dead still hold power. The desert is littered with bones, but it is also alive with memory, and memory can kill as surely as heat or disease. In the end, the Curse of Tutankhamun is but one chapter in a longer book of human belief. It is the most famous because it happened in the age of global media, when a single death could circle the world in hours. But behind it stand thousands of years of warnings inscribed in hieroglyphs, whispered in villages, and told by candlelight in Cairo and London alike. Death in the desert has always had its legends, and Tutankhamun's curse is their heir. A century has passed since Howard Carter first peered into the darkness of Tutankhamun's tomb, yet the curse lingers still. It appears in headlines whenever a new discovery is made in the Valley of the Kings. It surfaces in television documentaries, in horror films, in casual conversations when someone jokes about tempting fate. Rational explanations have been offered countless times. Coincidence, microbes, sensational journalism. But the myth refuses to die. In fact, it thrives. To understand why, one must look not to Egypt alone, but to the human psyche itself, and the ways in which fear, story, and the longing for meaning grant immortality to legends. The curse endures first because it speaks to one of humanity's oldest taboos, disturbing the dead. Across cultures and millennia, the sanctity of the grave has been nearly universal. To violate it invites punishment, whether from vengeful spirits in folklore, divine wrath in scripture, or simple social scorn. Tutankhamun's tomb, sealed for more than 3,000 years, embodied this taboo on a monumental scale. Its discovery was a triumph of archaeology, but also a transgression against an ancient sanctity. The curse became a way of expressing unease at this trespass. Even in an age of science, the sense that the dead should be left undisturbed persists. Secondly, the curse offers a narrative of justice in a world often devoid of it. Lord Carnarvon was not simply a man who died of septicemia. He was a wealthy British aristocrat, emblem of imperial privilege, who financed the intrusion into another nation's heritage. His sudden, eerie death became poetic justice in the eyes of Egyptians, who saw it as symbolic vengeance for centuries of exploitation. To the broader world, the curse suggested that greed and arrogance would be punished, that even kings long dead could strike down those who defied them. In this way, the curse functioned as morality tale as much as superstition. The endurance of the curse also lies in the power of mystery. Tutankhamun himself was a minor pharaoh in life, but in death he became a global icon precisely because his tomb was untouched, his mask serene, his treasures dazzling. The curse added another layer of allure. Beauty alone might have drawn admiration, but beauty laced with dread captivates more deeply. The golden mask is not just art. It is a face that seems to watch, judge, and perhaps condemn. Visitors to exhibitions often whisper, as though afraid to be overheard by the pharaoh himself. Fear sharpens awe. The curse gave Tutankhamun's treasures their edge. Media ensured the curse's immortality. The press of the 1920s, eager for spectacle, exaggerated every coincidence into omen. Later, novels, stage plays, and films carried the myth into new generations. From Boris Karloff's The Mummy in 1932 to 21st century blockbusters, the idea of tomb curses has become cultural archetype. Children who have never heard of Carnarvon still know that mummies carry curses. Once a story enters popular culture so deeply, it ceases to require factual basis. It becomes self-sustaining, feeding on repetition, adaptation, and reinvention. The curse also endures because it embodies contradictions that fascinate us. It is at once rationally false and emotionally true, debunked yet believed. Skeptics may point to statistics, but believers require only a single eerie death to confirm their fears. In this way, the curse reflects the tension between science and superstition, modernity and antiquity. To believe in it is to resist reduction of mystery to mere biology. To deny it is to assert human mastery over fear. Either way, it provokes engagement. Few myths are so perfectly balanced between disbelief and belief, forever unresolved. Psychology adds another dimension. Humans are drawn to what frightens them, provided the threat is distant enough to be safe. Horror films, ghost stories, haunted houses, all offer controlled encounters with fear. The curse functions similarly. To stand before Tutankhamun's treasures, to whisper of his vengeance, is to experience a free zone of danger without real risk. The thrill lies in imagining that the pharaoh's eyes, preserved in gold, might still see you. Fear becomes entertainment, and in entertainment, the curse is immortal. The curse has also been nourished by its adaptability. In the 1920s, it was a story of imperial arrogance punished. In the 1930s and 1940s, it became fuel for Gothic horror. In the 1970s, during the global tour of Tutankhamun's treasures, it was revived as marketing tool, enticing millions to line up for exhibitions. In the 21st century, it persists in documentaries that promise to reveal the truth behind the curse. Each era reshapes the legend to fit its anxieties and desires. Its survival is ensured not because it is static, but because it evolves. Even within Egypt, the curse has shifted meanings. For nationalists, it symbolized resistance to foreign exploitation. For local guides, it became part of storytelling, enriching tours with whispers of pharaonic vengeance. For modern Egyptians, it is both source of pride and curiosity. Pride that their heritage captivates the world, curiosity at the power of myth to endure alongside science. In this way, the curse bridges past and present, local and global, reality and legend. At its core, the curse endures because it offers a paradoxical form of immortality. Tutankhamun ruled for barely a decade, a boy king whose reign was overshadowed by predecessors and successors. Without his intact tomb, he would have been little more than footnote in history. Instead, through the curse, he became eternal. The boy who died forgotten now commands awe across continents. His name is spoken in classrooms, his face reproduced on posters, his treasures visited by millions. Death erased his reign. Legend restored it. The curse, in giving fear to his name, granted him immortality. And so the curse lives on, not in hieroglyphs, not in microbes, but in us. In our fear of death, our fascination with mystery, our longing for stories that make sense of fate. It is not proof of supernatural vengeance, but of human imagination. Tutankhamun's curse endures because we need it to endure. It is a mirror of our anxieties and our awe, our reverence for the past, and our suspicion that the dead may not rest easily. The boy king sleeps still in the valley of the kings, his body fragile, his treasures magnificent. The desert has reclaimed silence, but the world has not. For as long as we tell stories, the curse will whisper on, reminding us that the past is never truly past, that the dead are never wholly silent, and that fear itself is a kind of eternity. As the centenary of Tutankhamun's discovery passes, the legend of the curse remains lodged in the cultural imagination, an inescapable shadow trailing the boy king's treasures. Yet its legacy is more than whispers of death or Gothic spectacle. The curse has become a prism through which we view not only Egypt's past, but also the modern world's relationship to history, power, and mortality. To understand the legacy of the curse is to recognize that it is less about Tutankhamun himself and more about the stories humanity chooses to tell. The first part of that legacy lies in Egyptology itself. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb catapulted archaeology into global fame, transforming what had been a specialized discipline into front-page news. The curse magnified the discovery, ensuring that even those with no interest in antiquity were captivated. Newspapers that once ignored excavation reports now devoted columns to every artifact removed from the tomb, every rumor whispered in Luxor. Public fascination, driven in no small part by the curse, generated funding for museums, exhibitions, and further expeditions. Archaeology gained glamour, though at the cost of being entangled with sensationalism. Tutankhamun's curse ensured that archaeology would never again be seen as dry scholarship alone. It became adventure, mystery, and myth. The legacy also reshaped Egypt's relationship with its own heritage. In the early 20th century, Egypt was still under British influence, its antiquities often flowing outward to European and American museums. The legend of the curse, however, lent weight to nationalist claims that Tutankhamun's treasures should remain in Egypt. Officials insisted that the pharaoh's wrath was not a tale to amuse foreigners, but a warning that his eternity must not be stolen. When disputes arose over the division of finds, the Egyptian government prevailed, keeping the entire collection in Cairo. The curse, whether real or imagined, became part of a broader assertion of sovereignty. Today, Tutankhamun's treasures are symbols of national pride, their story inseparable from Egypt's reclamation of its past. In the West, the curse's legacy lies in culture and imagination. From the 1920s onward, it shaped literature, theater, and cinema. The mummy became monster, the tomb became stage for horror. Films from Boris Karloff's The Mummy, 1932, to 21st century reboots owe their existence to the legend. Even as audiences laugh at bandaged monsters lumbering across screens, they are participating in the same fascination that gripped readers of 1923 headlines. The curse became genre, fueling gothic horror and adventure alike. Beyond entertainment, it also entered language. To call something cursed is to invoke Tutankhamun's shadow, whether jokingly or seriously. Another part of the legacy lies in science's relationship with myth. For decades, microbiologists, epidemiologists, and psychologists have examined the curse, offering rational explanations for the deaths and illnesses surrounding the tomb. In doing so, they used the legend as a case study of ancient pathogens, of toxic environments, of the power of belief. Even when disproving it, science acknowledged the curse's importance. It became a bridge between superstition and rational inquiry, illustrating how fear could drive both story and investigation. The curse's legacy is thus double-edged. It fed superstition, but it also fueled scientific curiosity. Most profoundly, the curse endures because it touches universal human themes. It is about mortality, the boy king's death, the deaths of those who entered his tomb, the inevitability of death itself. It is about justice, the idea that greed and arrogance meet punishment, that even the powerless can find retribution in eternity. It is about memory, the fear of being forgotten, and the strange immortality that comes when myth enshrines a name. Tutankhamun, a minor pharaoh, became the most famous of all precisely because of the curse. His reign was short and unremarkable, but his legend is eternal. The curse also forces reflection on the ethics of archaeology. What does it mean to disturb the dead? To place sacred objects meant for eternity in glass cases for modern eyes? The curse dramatizes these questions. Whether one believes in supernatural vengeance or not, the legend makes us pause before intruding upon the past. It demands respect, reminding us that history is not inert but sacred, and that every excavation carries moral weight. In this sense, the curse is not warning of death, but of responsibility. Even in the present, the curse shapes how Tutankhamun is remembered. When his treasures toured the world in the 1970s, millions visited exhibitions not just for art, but for the aura of dread. When documentaries revisit his tomb today, they inevitably mention the curse, as though it were inseparable from the gold. Scholars may roll their eyes, but they too acknowledge that without the legend, Tutankhamun's story might not grip the public so powerfully. The curse is the hook that draws attention, even if reason follows later. And so, the legacy of the curse is paradoxical. It is both false and true, debunked yet immortal. It says nothing about Tutankhamun's actual powers and everything about humanity's imagination. It is a legend born of coincidence, fanned by newspapers, shaped by politics, and sustained by culture. But it has achieved what all legends seek: endurance. It has outlasted skeptics and believers alike. Perhaps the greatest irony is that Tutankhamun himself, had he lived, might never have been remembered. He was a boy king, overshadowed by greater pharaohs. Yet by dying young, being buried in a hastily prepared tomb, and being forgotten, he became immortal through rediscovery. His curse ensured his fame. Death erased his life, legend restored it. Today, his name is spoken more than Ramses or Akhenaten, not because of his deeds, but because of his myth. In this sense, the curse achieved what the Egyptians most desired for their kings: eternal memory. The curse of Tutankhamun, thus, stands at the boundary between history and myth. It reminds us that history is not only what happened, but also how it is remembered. The boy king's legacy is not simply his mask, his treasures, or his mummy, but the stories told about them. Some are true, some invented, but together they form a tapestry that ensures he is never forgotten. The curse is not Pharaoh's vengeance, but humanity's imagination, woven into eternity. The tale of Tutankhamun's curse is one of the most enduring legends of the modern age, a story that has outlived those who first told it and those who tried to explain it away. A century on, the boy king's name resonates not because of his reign, which was brief and politically minor, but because of what followed his death: a tomb discovered, a legend born, and a myth retold endlessly. The curse has given Tutankhamun an immortality he never possessed in life, raising profound questions about fear, memory, and the way humanity binds past to present. At its core, the curse reveals the universal human discomfort with disturbing the dead. Across cultures, burial places are sacred thresholds between the living and the afterlife. Tutankhamun's tomb, sealed for over 3,000 years, embodied that sanctity in concentrated form. When it was opened, the unease of transgression demanded explanation. Lord Carnarvon's death, eerily timed, became the perfect catalyst. The curse gave shape to unspoken fears, offering narrative coherence where coincidence might otherwise have reigned. But the endurance of the curse also speaks to humanity's hunger for justice. In a world where the innocent often suffer and the guilty often go unpunished, the idea that a boy king could strike down those who disturbed him carries moral power. The curse became poetic retribution against colonial exploitation, against arrogance, against human greed. Egyptians saw in it a vindication of their heritage. Westerners saw in it a morality tale of hubris undone. In both readings, the curse functioned not as superstition, but as story with ethical weight. There is also the allure of mystery. Tutankhamun's treasures alone would have fascinated the world, but the curse layered beauty with dread. All became sharper when tinged with fear. The golden mask did not merely dazzle. It seemed to watch, to judge, to condemn. The artifacts were not neutral objects but relics of power, alive with possibility. The curse thus transformed archaeology from scholarship into myth, ensuring that Tutankhamun's discovery would transcend the museum and enter legend. Science, of course, has offered explanations: fungal spores, toxic gases, psychosomatic illness, coincidence magnified by the press. These rational accounts dismantle the curse as literal truth, yet they cannot erase it. Facts may satisfy the intellect, but stories feed the imagination. And imagination is what endures. The curse's immortality lies in its refusal to be settled. Skeptics and believers both keep it alive, one by denying it, the other by affirming it. It persists because it inhabits the twilight between truth and myth, where uncertainty itself becomes power. What, then, is the true curse of Tutankhamun? Not death, but memory. The boy king, frail and forgotten, achieved in death what he never achieved in life: eternal renown. His curse ensures his name is spoken, his treasures revered, his story retold. He has outlasted conquerors, empires, and centuries of silence. The curse is less a malediction than a guarantee that he, who died too soon, would never be forgotten. In this sense, the legend is less about pharaohs than about us. We tell the story because it reflects our own fears and desires: fear of death, desire for justice, awe at the unknown. The curse is not Tutankhamun's voice, but humanity's, whispering across time about the things that haunt us still. To believe in it is not to surrender reason, but to acknowledge that reason alone cannot satisfy the heart. We need mystery, we need awe, we need stories that remind us of the sacred even in an age of science. And so the curse endures, not in hieroglyphs, not in microbes, but in our imagination. It is the echo of ancient warnings, amplified by modern fears, sustained by the timeless human need to find meaning in mortality. The boy king sleeps still in the valley of the kings, but his legend walks among us, silent, eternal, and unshakable. That is his true immortality. That is the real curse, that we cannot stop telling his story.